Rhythm up, ZihKing in the building. No, it's been a while, but I'm back. And to grace you with my return, I'm going to share 5 tips off the top of my dome to help with your music production. How me sound? Now, when I started out music, and I think this is the same for many producers like myself who started this music production way before the internet became a big thing. The main challenge for me was obtaining that quality commercial professional sound. It was a big challenge back then, and most of it was trial and error. So with these 5 tips, hopefully you can get a little bit closer to where you want to be. Alright, so the first tip is to level up or improve your sound selection game. If you want your productions to sound crisp, professional, commercial, all of that jazz, then definitely you need to improve your sound selection game. So how do I achieve this? Well, first you have to listen, label, then recreate. Now the first thing, listen. Find some well-polished, well-produced music and listen actively and keenly to how these sounds sound. It might sound a little bit daunting, but take a step back. Focus on the drums first, the kick, the snare, the hi-hats. Move on to the next step and start labeling these sounds. Label them with words like dull, sharp, piercing, heavy, light, thin, thick, crunchy, punchy, lunchy. No, I'm getting out of hand, but I'm sure you get the gist by now. Try and label sounds with these terms for your own purpose. My crunchy doesn't have to sound like your crunchy. Define your crunchy and stick to that sound so that you can move on to the next step, which is to recreate this. Now that we have labeled all of these sounds, the next step is to recreate them. You're now in a much better position to create the sounds that you want. Using these terms, you can find sounds online, manipulate the ones you have in your DAW, or simply record new ones. Alright, so here's an example of poor sound selection. And here's an example of an improved sound selection. Now tip number 2. Improve the relationship between the kick and the bass. There are many ways you can go about this. The first way is to select the proper sounds. If you're selecting a kick that's dominant in the 50 Hz region, try to find a bass that's dominant elsewhere, so there's not much conflict going on between the two. The next step is to use EQ. If your kick is dominant in the 50 Hz region again, then remove that region in the bass. And if the bass is dominant in the 80 Hz region, then you probably reduce the kick in that region. The final step is to sidechain the kick with the bass, so that every time the kick plays, it ducks the volume in the bass. Here's an example of that. Let's focus on the kick in isolation. So if you look closely, it's mostly concentrated around 53 Hz. You can see this information here. So that's where the kick is mostly centered. Now let's look at the bass. So as you can see, the bass is mainly around 45 to 80 Hz. This is going to compete with the kick. Let's listen to them together. We can hear the kick, but mostly because the volume is high. Now let's create more space for the kick using sidechain on the bass, so that every time the kick plays, the bass ducks in volume. Now we're going to split the bass in two. High end separate from the low end. Compression is going to be applied only to the low end, while the high end remains intact. For the low end, I consider the low end 150 and below. So you can see that with the EQ here. And compression is going to be applied to the bass in this section only when the kick is being played. So add a compressor, click the sidechain option here, source the track with the kick, and then adjust these parameters so that when the kick is being played, the bass ducks in volume. In this case, I'll add a fast attack time. I want the bass to be attenuated as soon the instant the kick is being played. Now for the release time, I set the release time to anywhere between 75 and 100. This is sufficient because the kick doesn't last long and you want a relatively quick release so that the bass isn't held down for too long. Now the ratio affects how much ducking happens. An aggressive ratio of 6 to 1 is okay. The threshold now is the volume at which the compressor is activated. In this case, it's 19.7. So let's take a look at that. If it's high, no compression is being done. Now listen keenly. If you're using studio monitors or headphone, you probably can hear the difference. Let me exaggerate it. So the bass is aggressively being ducked if the threshold is very low. So let's set it back to the original. And the purpose of all of this is to improve the quality of the entire mix by removing the mud and the competition that's going on in the low end of the track. Tip number 3, add delay and reverb to your instruments. Reverb and delay create depth and motion respectively. Now, let's start off with delay. Delay is very easy. Just add delay and have fun. Don't do too much. You can add delay to any form of melody you have. You'll be surprised to know how much life you can add to your track by adding an 8-note delay to your piano. Faintly, here's an example. Let's take a look at this dry piano. It sounds too dry and dead, so let's add some ping pong delay. That same 8-note delay can be applied to your hi-hats. Give more motion and activity going on. And next tip is to add reverb before you add the delay. Now, before I get to that, let's talk about the reverb itself. Reverb is a very, very powerful tool. You can create the perfect reverb by calculating the decay time. Let's take a look at this reverb. This is how my reverb sounds. Without. With. How did I achieve this reverb? I calculated the decay time for all my reverbs, and this is how I do it. First, I look at the BPM of the track. In this case, it's 95. In all cases, I divide 60,000 by the BPM of the track. 60,000 divided by 95, we get that value is the millisecond time for a quarter note using the BPM of 95. Now, if I multiply this by 2, I get the half note, which is 1.26 seconds. That's a relatively short decay time. If I want a medium decay time, I multiply this by a multiple of 2 and I get 2.526 seconds. And if I want a longer reverb, I multiply this by 2 again and I get 5.05 seconds. So I have one medium time reverb going into a longer reverb of 5.5 seconds for this specific track. Now, using this technique to find the decay time of the reverb, you can manipulate the perception of sounds in your track. A shorter decay time will bring the sound forward. A longer decay time will push the sound back in the mix. So use this to your advantage to create depth and dimension. You can use this same reverb technique before your delay to manipulate the position of the delayed sounds. Try it out, tell me what you think. It's a wonderful technique. Tip number 4, apply a high-pass filter to your instruments. When dealing with instruments other than the kick, the bass, and probably the toms, it's best to remove all unwanted low frequencies. You may be tempted to think that these frequencies are non-existent on some instruments, but it's a good practice to put a high filter regardless. You can do this aggressively for some instruments and very subtle with others. For example, let's take a look at the piano. Adding an aggressive high-pass filter may not be the best choice. However, a subtle high-pass filter will keep certain low elements intact while removing the unnecessary sounds that may be competing with the bass and the kick. For this specific bell, low frequencies may be undesirable. We are not hearing them now, but they are there. Let's take a look. According to this EQ, there's a buildup of low frequencies here. They are not necessary and we'll remove them. If you do this for all your instruments, it can drastically increase the quality of your production by removing all the mud. And I repeat, be very aware that even though these frequencies may be inaudible for one instrument, when working with 2 or 3 or even more instruments within the entire mix, if you don't remove them on the individual tracks, then definitely you're going to have a problem with them combining and causing unnecessary mud in your mix. Tip number 5, keep it simple. This is one of the hardest things to do as a beat composer. Keep it simple. I face this challenge even today. We can get caught up in our mix sometimes that we tend to overcompensate, thinking that it's too empty or you need more elements to make it rich, active, full, fluffy, excitable, but that may not be necessary for your intended market. Now ask yourself the question, am I doing this instrumental for a beat competition or a film? In these instances, the instruments may be the main subject of the track, so it may require some level of complexity and diversity with the instruments. However, when working with artists, the vocals itself is an instrument and you have to make space for that. I am guilty of this. It's not uncommon for an entire music production, which is intended for an artist, to have bass, kick, snare, hi-hat, one melody, and a harmony. And the harmony in this case probably be some chords or a pad in the background. 6 elements: kick, bass, snare, hi-hat, a melody, and some accompanying pad or chord progression. Simple. Any additional element may compete with the vocals intended for this track, so keep it simple. Now I'll attempt to dissect the psychology behind this problem. I believe that when working with music for long periods of time, we become desensitized to all the elements within our track, and we tend to lose the wow factor of the elements inside. So we try to compensate with other elements to revamp what we perceive to be boring, empty, or lame. So to combat this problem, try to take some breaks so you don't lose that vibe and try to overcompensate with other instruments. So that's it. 5 amazing tips to improve your music production. If they were helpful, let me know in the comments below. That being said, big up yourself 5 million times. Amen.